Welcome to this podcast. We're going to discuss a few of the facts about hydrotherapy and how it pertains to naturopathic medicine and natural medicine today. Hydrotherapy has a long history in medicine, and naturopathy as such really sprung directly from it. The founding members of naturopathic movement were really well trained in hydrotherapy. Hippocrates mentions it for fevers, for getting toxins out of the body, etc. And some of the famous hydrotherapists that influenced early naturopathy include Vincent Preisnitz. He was born in 1799, so he lived the first half of the 19th century, and he was a farmer by trade. He was self-taught, and through his own injuries and his experience treating them with a lot of cold water plunges, he was able to discover the healing properties of water. He also read a book by one of the esteemed hydrotherapists, Johann Hahn, about the use of cold water, and he grew up close to nature and saw how animals would also use cold water for injured limbs or paws or hoofs, and got the idea. He gained some aptitude in this and then became a very successful clinician. People just sought him out, even though he wasn't a certified MD, and was able to attract patients from all over the place. He eventually gets the ire of the medical authorities, which is often the case, but he's eventually acquitted, and the government of Austria, which is where he lived, allowed him to treat people with some sort of dispensation to do so. It was a pretty brutal treatment, extreme cold plunges, very vigorous exercise, a lot of pure water drinking, which would keep people hydrated while they were doing all this exercise, in a kind of a high-protein diet. So it was great for people that had a strong constitution. If you didn't, it might not work so well for you. It might be difficult to withstand. We still use cold in many applications today. Some people use it to get their circulation going, to have better-looking skin, but also for acute injuries, sprains and strains, and even in veterinary medicine. Johann Schroth, who had essentially the same lifespan or lifetime as Preisnitz, the first half of the 19th century, he was also from a farming background, not an MD, and got well using hydrotherapy. But he liked using a lot of heat, a lot of warm, moist applications. He liked overhydrating the body and then underhydrating for one day and allowing the person to detoxify. So he saw the body like a sponge, and he wanted to wring all the toxins out of them. I think these days we would not recommend anybody not hydrating for any length of time. But he did have a lot of success, and the idea was a very Hippocratic kind of idea, to burn toxins out of the body to create sort of induced fever, and it was a very simple diet he put people on. So they were both very successful and attracted people. Benedict Rust, who we'll talk about later this month, gave them credit for helping create what they later termed nature cure. But Father Knight deserves special mention. Father Sebastian Knight, he was very well known across the world and helped many people. He was a Roman Catholic priest. He was born in Bavaria, so southern Germany, and developed a disease called tuberculosis as a young man, as a young priest. And he had read Johann Hahn's book and decided to try it. Tuberculosis was a real health menace. You can see here the shadows, not just from vasculature, but these little circular lesions, which is where this patient has tuberculosis. It's a cluster of white blood cells and even fibrin and calcium trying to wall off a very hard to beat infection. The organism has a waxy hydrocarbon coat around it, so much so that industrial chemists have studied these waxes to learn how to make better waxes. So it's really hard for white blood cells to come up on this and blow it apart using free radical bursts. It's also hard for a phagocyte to ingest it and then really know what to do with it. So it's a tough enemy, and it's been very successful in infecting people. For the last 60 years, we've had drugs that kill TB, although there are resistant strains. So there's Father Knight. He was a good observer, so he took these cold water baths in the local river, and when he came out of the river, he noticed that his respiration had accelerated, his peripheral circulation had slowed down, his limbs were blanched, he was cool, and he wrapped himself up in heavy wool blankets. And he noted that his respiration then normalized, and the blood flow to his limbs came rushing back in. So he saw what we would now call a biphasic effect. There was a primary and secondary effect. We now know the primary effect was vasoconstriction, and the secondary effect was vasodilation. That's all mediated by the nervous system. So he might not have studied vascular physiology, but he was a really good observer, and he felt in his beliefs that the ailments for people to cure their suffering was found in nature, and we just had to uncover it. And again, he was very much a Hippocratic type of practitioner, trying to get toxins out of the body and clean the blood, in his terms. So, as he heals, he decides to also start to help others, other parishioners, nuns who live next door to his church, and he realizes that a lot of these people can't take this hydrotherapy boot camp that Preisnitz was doing. It's overwhelming for them. They're elderly, they're frail, they can't be put into an ice bath. So he starts to do contrast. So in other words, he keeps the heat reasonably short, and he makes the cold not too overwhelming. And what he finds is by contrasting hot and cold, using that biphasic effect, but in a smaller dose, he can get some kind of effect on circulation without having to be so harsh on the patients. He also begins to use some herbs to help people with digestion, with detoxification, as we would now call it. His reputation spreads far and wide. He writes books to help people help themselves, and he's known worldwide. He does a lot of work for people who can't pay. The Roman Catholic Church gives him a special dispensation to just focus on a healing ministry, and he devotes his life to this. He comes up with many other methods as well, including compresses to the body, different ways of pouring water. And this is important because he understands that you can isolate the treatment. So if it's a swollen knee, you might be able to just focus the treatment on the knee. So he adapts things to the patients, tries things, modifies them, and comes up with better and better protocols as the years and decades go on. And that's a good habit for all of us to have, is to continue to refine our methods based on what we observe or learn from patients. We have other forms of evidence now as well, but clinical experience can be really, really valuable. And he had lots of it. He worked tirelessly for many, many years. The diet was bland, and there was a lot of exercise and a lot of good habits. So upon his death, he is known throughout the world. Now, there's naturopathic physicians that use hydrotherapy today, and there's a form of it that's been adapted to a doctor's office, constitutional hydrotherapy, which you can really do with enough towels, a sink, a heat source, so you don't need a larger facility with tiles on the floor and things like that. There's many other forms too, but constitutional is great. You can get it, at least in Lombard, you can get it at our clinic there, but it starts off with hot and cold on the back, and essentially a hot towel treatment for a few minutes, and then those are removed and cold towels are applied. And they're left on for about 15 minutes until the body has actually warmed them up. And then the patient's flipped over and the process is repeated. So the cold can be a bit of a shock, but it's amazing how, in most people, their circulation can come back and warm that towel up. There's also a gentle electrical sine wave applied to different spinal levels or the solar plexus. So it's not hard to pull off in an office. Now, what's happening when we do this treatment? Well, think about the fact that we have cells in an extracellular matrix surrounded by fluid, and in order for metabolism to occur, we need afferent circulation that comes in, diffuses around the area, and in that diffusion, things like carbon dioxide and pyruvate or lactate and other things can diffuse out back into the circulation and clean the area. And hydrotherapy helps this happen faster. It does it through the nervous system, and when tissues need more nourishment, more oxygen, more glucose, neurologic signals cause vasodilation. So this diagram is just to illustrate for you that there's different levels of control of that circulation. This is something you'll learn about in second, but particularly fourth try when you do cardiovascular physiology. But the hypothalamus, sympathetic ganglia all play a part, and we react to these changes, to the sensory and sometimes physical input, such as cold, which can directly slow down metabolism. Now, on the evidence side, we know there's lots of good things that hydrotherapy can do. Here's a great review article that discusses things like baths, aquatherapy, aqua exercise, etc. There's physiological things happening in addition to vasoconstriction dilation. One is the mammalian diving reflex. So when we get our face especially exposed to water, our breathing rate starts to slow down. People that do free diving, for instance, over years begin to train their body to accentuate that reflex so that they can slow their metabolism down and stay underwater longer. That's a kind of extreme human performance, but just water exposures, such as in a bath, can start to do things like lower our blood pressure. So there's a lot of studies about it. A lot of them tend to be on the smaller side, and some are of pretty good quality. We know there's impacts on the cardiovascular system and even changes to lipoprotein levels. We know there's improvement to blood flow to the brain with hydrotherapy. And, not all this evidence rises to the level of a systematic review, although there are some such reviews for hydrotherapy. We know it certainly helps with arthritis. If you're curious about this, you can follow some of this. I think I put this in here because it was from the Cochrane Library, which is a very high level of meta-analysis, systematic reviews. So they concluded a silver level of evidence with beneficial effects of mineral baths compared to no treatment, but no clear effects. It doesn't mean they were useless, but the evidence wasn't indisputable. So I think that's a cause sometimes to not overinflate the possible benefit of hydrotherapy. At the same time, it can be really, really useful for people. And I think a lot of it is through the nervous system. We know that there's been benefit found for migraine patients with some impact on vagal tone. So, again, their sympathetic, parasympathetic balance seemed to improve. Also for people with heart disease, where they get no poor circulation into their heart muscle, sonotherapy under medical supervision has been helpful, which is amazing because not all these patients can get more blood flow into their heart. Emphysema is another example, and low back pain has some pretty good evidence. So we discuss constitutional. We do some of these therapies here, and even at physical therapy facilities, you'll see this kind of thing going on. So it has a long history in Germany and, of course, in the United States, as President Theodore Roosevelt used it Franklin Delano Roosevelt used it to recover from polio. FDR. So it's